Dean Cohen and Mary Waters and Rebecca, I mean, this is such an exciting conference. You feel so honored to be a part of it. This was an exciting committee to be engaged in because you meet your friends that you never see, like Mary says. So anyhow, we're going to go to the panel, The Gendering of International Migration. This panel examines how the causes and consequences of international migration reflect the different experiences of women and men and how they change over time. It will consider questions about the gender distribution of international migrants, how men and women maintain ties transnationally, and how people change when the cultural expectations of sending and receiving countries clash. I should tell you that we have 3 gems for speakers. You will not be disappointed. I'm going to introduce our speakers. The first one is Donna Gabaccia. I'm not going to read their bios because I really want to spend the time in the presentations, but she's the Rudolph Vecoli Chair of Immigration History and the former Director of Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. Then we're going to switch to Carola Suárez-Orozco, the Professor of Psychological Studies in Education, Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. We lost Carola, but we hope we can grab her again at some point. And then Robert Smith, the Professor of Sociology, Immigration Studies, and Public Affairs at the School of Public Affairs, City University of New York at Baruch College. We're actually going to have presentations around 12 to 15 minutes, and please hold your question until we finish the 3 presentations, and then we're looking forward to all of your questions and an engaging discussion. So I'm introducing Donna.
Okay, want to thank Liz and Mary, both of whom I already know, and the staff of the Radcliffe Institute, who I'm just getting to know, for planning this wonderful event. I am obviously so glad to be here with you this morning. Now, Sonia Nazario and Ruben Rumbaud have already introduced you this morning to the feminization of international migration, and especially in popular discussions, that feminization is usually associated with the impact of globalization in recent years. The assumption behind this labeling of migration as feminizing is, of course, that in the past, migrants were normally men. That's a very, very sturdy association, and it's one that helps to make the recent changes, which we sum up as feminization, seem almost revolutionary and shocking. I'm currently writing a book together with a sociologist and demographer, Catherine Donato, at Vanderbilt University. And as we write this book, which does focus on the feminization of migration, we've been quite surprised by what we found. And I want to share a few of those surprises. They're a little bit less surprising based on Ruben's talk, which you've already heard, but I'm going to tweak still further what Ruben had to say. So let's begin by looking at one influential visualization of the feminization of migration. It appeared as part of a 2006 World Population Report by the United Nations. I'm an historian. I mainly work with qualitative and archival evidence, but I have been fascinated by how scholars, policymakers, journalists, and activists have used empirical data, like the kind you see here, embedding it most frequently in discourses of, at worst, moral panic, this is bad for us, and at best, as a problem possibly in need of a solution. What that tells you is that I'm going to focus here in my comments on both the empirical phenomenon of feminization and the discourses that have surrounded its discovery. Let's just zero in for a moment on that empirical evidence. At the global level, this figure shows an increase in the proportion female among international migrants over 45 years of about 2.9 percentage points, from around 47% in 1960 to almost 50% today. It shows that the percentage female has steadily increased in Africa, Europe, Latin America, and Oceania, but it's also decreased in the last couple of decades in Asia and in North America. One of our big surprises on our project and co-authorship was seeing how disciplinary differences influence the way we interpreted this data. I looked at this as an historian, and I wondered, for God's name, what is all this fuss about 2.9% feminization? As an historian, actually, I wanted to know what happened before 1960, because the impact of globalization after 1960 seemed really quite small, and globally, migrations were already 47% female in 1960. As a demographer, or thinking as a demographer at least, Catherine Donato, my co-author, instead assumed that very small changes could have significant consequences in large populations, and we're looking here at really large populations. But as a demographer, she also knew, and Ruben referred to this in his final moments as well, that variations in gender composition are actually quite predictable in human populations, but they're contingent on age distribution. For example, in a population with a lot of aging people, the proportion female inevitably goes up. Normally, that means in sedentary populations, gender composition varies between about 48 and 51% female. In other words, it's not terribly different from what we're looking at there as feminization in the UN data. When Catherine used a common demographer's statistical tool to control for the impact of age distribution on gender composition, she got the following results. This is for US immigrants only. The feminization of immigrant populations looks considerably less dramatic once we correct for the impact of aging populations on gender composition. And here what we see is that the feminization of US immigration, as Ruben also pointed out, actually began after 1910, the year when historical presence of females among migrants had fallen to its historical nadir. After 1970, the proportion female actually fell. And I want to emphasize, however, look at the big picture here, that over 150 years, women and girls among immigrants in the United States were between 46 and 50% of American immigrants, which is just marginally outside the normal range of variations that we see in all human populations. And when Catherine used this same statistical tool on the UN data, she found the representation of women migrants worldwide had increased by exactly 1% since 1960. So then we both said, what's all the fuss about? To try to understand the excited, often anxious, and sometimes positively negative discourses that have surrounded discovery of the feminization of migration, we focused on a number of issues that I think will resonate through this morning's panel and perhaps for the rest of the day. First of all, studies that discuss the feminization of migration still, in the main, create a framework for talking about women or girl migrants rather than an analysis of why gender composition varies or what the consequences of that gender variation might be. These discussions most often discuss women immigrants not as migrants who cause problems, that's gendered male in the scholarly discourse, men cause problems, but rather women immigrants who have problems that require policy solutions. And indeed, if you read the 2006 UN report, you would find that it focuses mainly on the problems of trafficking, exploitative domestic work, genital cutting, and forced marriage. Now, don't get me wrong. Women immigrants face real problems. But the main takeaway of our book will be that those problems are not caused by feminization. They are a product of international structures of inequality structures that create inequality in different ways for men, women, and children. We then started to think about why it is that studies of the feminization of migration still so often analyze women and children and not men and gender relations. And I could talk for hours on that issue. I'm not going to. I just want to call your attention to what that issue tells us about our interdisciplinary field of study. Think about the images that you see here. For the last 20 years, gender studies has become associated with the epistemologically radical relativism of post-structuralist philosophy and with the deconstruction of texts, symbols, representations, and semiotics, largely using methods coming from the humanities, from literary, and from cultural studies. By contrast, social scientists, who more often think of themselves as working within migration studies, prefer empirical data, and many of them are epistemologically rooted in the positive sciences associated with quantitative methodologies, hypothesis testing, theory building, and the like. In fact, I think many social scientists continue to believe that our empirical data records migrants' sex and not some kind of representation of gender. And I'm not offering that as a critique, but simply as a statement of what separates still gender studies often from migration studies. And in fact, even in our conversations preparing for this panel, we recognize that many social scientists believe there's no way for them to contribute to gender studies, given its epistemological foundations. And in our book, we actually are going to try, crazy people that we are, to overcome this divide, but that's a complex issue I'm going to leave for the Q&A. For now, just ponder the tension here, because it's in that tension, I think, that we see the beginnings of an explanation for the persistence of women-centered research, even within gender studies. Let me now conclude with a few very, very broad and perhaps overly simplified takeaway points from the book that we're writing on the feminization of migration. First of all, let's be quite clear about one thing. It is not biological difference or sex that drives variations over time or space in immigrant gender composition, and that's why we increasingly talk about gender ratios, as Ruben did, and not sex ratios, which is the term that demographers, frankly, still prefer. It's the interaction of gender relations and gender ideologies in sending and receiving countries within historically changing structures of global inequality that drive these variations. And we need gender analysis of that social inequality. Second, while most migrations past and present have in fact been modestly male predominant, examples of gender balanced and even female majority migrations are scarcely uncommon. We found gender balanced and female predominant migrations in the early modern transatlantic slave trade. We found them in 19th century mass migrations, not the mainstream, but important margins. And we found them, of course, among contemporary migrants. Third, however, there is no one predictable set of historical structures of inequality, gender relations, or gender ideologies that will predictably produce female majorities or male majorities. Our knowledge is, and I think will always remain, historically and spatially incredibly contingent, and we get the best understanding of the causes of gender composition variation when we look at case studies, and especially when we pair case studies of heavily male migrations and their contemporary migrations that are gender balanced or female predominant. Fourth, and this was probably the biggest surprise for us, very, very few studies document long-term or measurable consequences for migrations of differing gender composition. We have found a lot of very wild speculation. And we have even found some quite interesting and sensible theorization of the consequences of gender variations. But empirically, scholars, at least to date, have at best demonstrated some modest impact on local marriage customs, local labor markets, and also perhaps on the age of migrant first marriage and childbearing and rates of marriage overall among migrant populations. Overall, in fact, what has been most striking for us is how quickly unbalanced migrant populations find ways of rebalancing themselves, and that's the abstract demographer's way of addressing the kind of stories that we heard, especially from Sonia early this morning. They rebalance themselves, often in the face of huge obstacles. Finally, and for all of the reasons I've just mentioned, our book argues that the feminization, or what others have termed the feminization of migration, might better be understood as a long-term global convergence towards gender balance in international migration. There is not much to fear in that convergence, nor does that convergence itself produce the kinds of problems that we have been, and will continue to address at this symposium. Convergence towards gender balance should not, we believe, be conflated with our fears of recent globalization, nor should it be viewed merely as a product of global inequality. It began a century ago. It has continued across that century under rapidly changing structures of international inequality. And convergence towards gender balance has actually meant that across the 20th and into the 21st century, migrants have, at least in the demographic sense, increasingly resembled the natives of the host societies where they settle. Now, we haven't actually written the conclusion to our book, but we will seriously consider, and I hope you will also seriously consider, the possibility that gender balance among international migrants is an indicator mainly of how normal and predictable, and dare I say it, actually safe, human mobility has become over the course of the 20th century. But of course, not for everyone. Let's focus on the problems of social inequality internationally and stop seeing the mobility of women and children as an aberrant or revolutionary or negative development. I want all of us to have choices, whether to move or to stay. But without the freedom to move, one does not enjoy the freedom to stay. And those freedoms are the kinds of social inequalities that we need to address. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to join all of you today. My plan is to provide a gendered perspective on pathways of well-being. I want to thank Liz, Mary, and Maggie for providing this opportunity for what has been a fascinating conversation thus far. I'm going to be drawing on three basic bodies of literature in 12 to 15 minutes, and to try to give you a kind of psychological overview. The first is a kind of family systems point of view on well-being. The second is more of focuses on both on psychological well-being, particularly on women. Which takes more of a gender as a social systems perspective. And the third looks at boys and girls, comparing boys and girls, looking at educational outcomes. Because I think children get forgotten in the equation, and when you look at it from that point of view, boys begin to begin to be the worried category. So I want to sort of keep all three of those perspectives in our view. So if you look at if you think about family systems, and now I'm going to be talking frankly, gross simplifications. There are always, kind of outliers and exceptions, but we frequently see these patterns. Migration places tremendous strains on family systems, right? And so we often see changing roles in the family. We see women frequently becoming empowered and men becoming disempowered with migration. So we see family disillusions, sometimes prior to migration, as Sonia alluded to, during the migration, and then or after the migration. So that's one of the things that we often see. We see the classic acculturation dissonance. That is usually, that has been described as generational, where, the children learn language more quickly, the cultural norms more quickly. But we also see gendered patterns of acculturation dissonance, where in some families, the women are taking jobs where they are coming into contact with the culture of origin. Maybe they're working as housekeepers. Maybe they're taking jobs where they're having direct contact with a new culture of origin, whereas men are more in jobs where they are, in kind of ethnic enclaves and having very limited contact, and so the women are acculturating much more quickly. In other groups, on the other hand, women are staying at home and having almost no contact. So, there are two patterns, and so there you have you may see acculturative dissonances that are gendered. You see a classic pattern of hyper-surveillance of girls. And that's done by the parents, and that's done by the community. There's a downside to that, where the girls are really resentful and feeling, encerrada, the lockdown girls that Robert talks about. I talk about it as the encerrada syndrome. The downside is, there's a lot of family tension around that. The upside is the girls are more protected. They're off the streets. They stay out of trouble. And so there's, there are ups and downs in that. There's household responsibilities. Girls have a lot more of it. Older siblings also have more of it. So you see hyper-responsible older siblings, and then so we can talk about conferring advantages and disadvantages around those issues. I've allowed 5 minutes per topic, so I could talk a whole hour on this, but I want to move over to the kind of steep challenges that women bear in the migratory process. So we see that women are twice as likely as men to be widowed, divorced, or separated. Twice as likely as migrant men to be widowed, divorced, and separated. This often is part of what propels the migration. So they're taking care of their children. And that's part of what motivates. So they're also less likely to have a BA or an advanced degree. So that's a disadvantage. So they often have children in tow. And it can be either here or there. Often they are taking care of children back home, or they have children here. That's confers upon them a tremendous sense of responsibility. They're often putting away every cent they have to take care of those children. That puts them in at higher levels of poverty rates, right? So every penny they're spending or earning is going into taking care of their children. There's Leticia Abrego shows that migrant men, they're pretty responsible, not as responsible as the women in making sure that their kids get taken care of. This is a huge issue. And then the ones who stay in relationships often need to continue to juggle patriarchal cultural expectations. Again, we could talk a lot longer about this, but I'm trying to cover in 12 to 15 minutes the issues women deal with. I want to briefly talk about the huge burdens of undocumented status and Sonia talked about it so eloquently. I can just talk about it in 2 minutes because you did it in 45 minutes in an extraordinary way. This is an image from of a little girl who was being torn out of her mother's arms during one of the ICE raids. But it captures it rather dramatically. So there are a number of risks associated with undocumented status, the family separations that Sonia talked about and I've written about, and others, of course. There's the problem of leaving children behind, either ahead of time because you have to, for all the reasons Sonia talked about, because you need to take care of you realize your children will starve, so you're going to come ahead and leave your kids behind. There's used psychological tolls from the long separations that you think it's going to be a year, but it turns out to be 10. And then when you're finally reunified with your children, either because your children tried to make that unbearable crossing or because you finally saved up enough money to make it happen, the very problematic and complicated reunifications. And then there's this huge financial tolls. Then there are the deportations that the image I just drew upon. And there, we're a deportation nation now, as Dan Kanstrom coined, with 400,000 people being deported and huge amounts of families being torn apart. There are the issues of vulnerabilities to violence during the crossing. And to exploitations post the crossing, which we've alluded to, and then there we're finding patterns of vulnerabilities to domestic abuse, both psychological and physical. So when you have a man who is documented and the woman who is not, there are threats of violence as well as power dynamics of using that to control the woman around. Just using that as a power dynamic in the relationship. I want to turn to issues of children now. We have more children today than ever before who are of immigrant origin. They're the fastest growing child population. Nearly 1 in 4 children is a child of an immigrant, and by 2020 it'll be 1 in 3. So there's always been a kind of a gender, historically, using the historical pattern, there's been a pattern of men doing better in education than women, but the role of gender in education has flipped in recent years. There's a gender gap in the U.S., so there's about, so women are doing generally better than men. It's particularly pronounced among immigrant and minority populations. And this gap is a powerful factor in predicting segmented adaptation and assimilation of the next generation. This graph it sort of shows you kind of in visual terms a pattern that came out of a longitudinal study that I did with Marcelo Suárez-Orozco and a whole team of researchers. We followed 400 immigrant kids from Haiti, Mexico, Central America, the Dominican Republic, and China, and we followed them for 5 years from approximately 8th grade to 12th grade, and this is their GPA, right, for over the course of 5 years, and we show a downward decline over the course of 5 years. Pink line girls, blue line boys. So you see a gender gap very graphically. It starts out, an obvious gap, and then it just gets wider over time. And this is a pattern that you see in lots of groups. It's not, so it just kind of shows the pattern that I'm talking about. Some whys about it. How do we explain it? And we drew on all sorts of data, interviews with kids and parents and teachers, ethnographies, teacher behavior checklists, among others. So girls seem to work harder and pay more attention than boys in school. Girls had better relationships with peers that supported them, not just emotionally, but scholastically. Boys' relationships with teachers and school authorities were not as positive. as those of girls. There were lower teacher expectations of boys in general, and the relationships with teachers was much more, from pretty early on, were much more corrective in nature, and that just intensified the older they got. So it's take off your hat, stop doing this, stop doing that, sit down, do that, and that kind of doesn't make for really good relationships. But this is not in some ways all that surprising. It parallels non-immigrant populations. It's especially minority boys in the US, and it's also similar to immigrant origin boys in other countries. So, we're not from another planet on this one, unfortunately. The boys also seem much more susceptible to messages of social exclusion, of which we have a lot in our nation. This sign, which has finally been taken off the highways in California, apparently 2 or 3 years ago, but this is kind of a symbol for social exclusion. But the national narratives around this have not gone away. So future directions for research, last slide, I'm on time. I think we need to be thinking of, so we looked for a lot of differences in between men and women, girls and boys. Well, there are differences, there's no doubt about it, but you know what? There are a lot of non-differences too. So, boys and girls, men and women, they're the same in some ways. They're different too, but they're the same in other ways. So we shouldn't always think of each other as different species. So I think I want to introduce the idea that we can, non-differences are interesting too. Differences are interesting, so are non-differences. So we should be thinking about whether, and if so, when and why it makes a difference to be, men and women, boys and girls. We should always be thinking about what are the processes at play. So this is why I always make a pitch for mixed methods. So quantitative tells us, the what's, the qualitative tells us the whys and hows. We should consider all sorts of different outcomes, psychological outcomes as well as academic outcomes, et cetera. And then we shouldn't focus not only on pathologies, but also on different forms of well-being. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So I first would like to thank the organizers and the Radcliffe Institute for inviting us. Also, if you haven't seen Quetzal, the band that played in this venue last night, you should go check them out online and buy their CDs because they were amazing. They won a Grammy. I didn't know that. I don't get out enough, apparently. But they were amazing. So I'll use one of my minutes to send a shout out for Quetzal. And the dean was dancing better than anybody. So anyway. So I'm an ethnographer, and I've spent the last 20 to 25 years working in Mexico and in New York with Mexican immigrants. The work that I'm going to talk about today draws from a project I've done following children of immigrants for 10 to 15 years. Some of the kids I've known since they were born, some more than 20 years, but most of them 10 to 15 years. Within the context of that research, I also did some work on a domestic violence group, a group of women who were in a domestic violence group therapy setting, and I'll talk a bit about what their experience has been. And the approach that I want to take here is to talk about. We've had two other kinds of, the gender and historical perspective, and then the effects of gender on different kinds of developmental outcomes. And me being a more qualitative guy, I'm looking at the negotiation of gender. And the approach I'm taking looks at the negotiation of what gender means, what it means to be a man and a woman. And these things happen. They're negotiated. They change over time. They happen in family contexts. They happen within the context of institutions, cultures, legal statuses, and within the context of intergenerational bargains, right? Immigrants have an immigrant bargain where the kids are supposed to do better than the parents to redeem the sacrifice that their parents made in migrating, and there are socially expected steps and durations. There's certain things you're supposed to do by a certain time to be seen as a successful man or woman. So I want to talk about those things. So there's two empirical examples, and the domestic violence And I'm going to talk a lot about legal status and how that affects these processes. The first one has to do with domestic violence. So one of the projects that I have worked on here has been looking at the ways in which women who have been embroiled in domestic violence in New York, primarily Mexican women, have ended up negotiating their way out of that and what it means to be a woman for them in that context. And a lot of the histories are things that we're familiar with, right? A lot of them were people who'd grown up in houses where there had been domestic violence. Many had been sexually abused. And in Mexico, the police had said, when the mothers of these women had complained to the police had said, but he's your husband. Like as if there was no discussion about this. He's your husband. There's no domestic violence. And they carried this with them. And what one of the women said to me is, what I learned from my mother was silence. And my siblings learned silence. And there's a concept that the anthropologist Federico Besra used as inappropriate, sentimientos inapropiados, inappropriate feelings of being angry or challenging the authority of the male gaze or male prerogative. And so many of the women that I worked with here had carried this into their relationships in New York and kept this silence in New York within domestically violent situations. However, they were in a new context, and there were two very significant kinds of interventions that happened here. One of them is that the police in New York, for all of the problems they have, they're fairly good about intervening in domestic violence issues. And when there's domestic violence, they separate the partners. There's none of this, he's your husband. I mean, not in the cases that I've known about anyway. They've all talked about how good the police were. They had a female cop, someone who spoke Spanish. And these women were involved in a group therapy setting that would derive directly from their being funneled into this domestic violence unit. And it was run by a social services agency. And here's the kicker, is that there's a legal provision that if you cooperate in the prosecution of a domestic violence crime against you, you get a road to legal status. So you've had these women who've been undocumented forever, who've been told to be silent and to be invisible, and suddenly you've got people telling them, no one can do that, and in addition to that, we're going to give you legal status. So the narratives of the women have changed from I was ashamed, my kids saw me getting hit, all this stuff, to I got my GED. I went and intervened because my child had a learning disability, and I was able to do this, and the other thing. So the narrative is entirely different. So you look at that over time, and then you take a step back and you think, okay, so this is New York City with all its problems, but in many cases, in many ways, it's a best case scenario because you've got the police who are attuned to these things and you have social service agencies that are attuned and things like that. Look at other cases, a woman in Georgia who was afraid to call the police because she was afraid she'd get deported. When her husband was beating her, she called the police and she got deported. All right? There's a program, 287G, in the United States where, or there has been, that if the police get deputized as immigration agents. However, I would argue the police cannot simultaneously protect you and seek to deport you. Because if in fact your undocumented status trumps every other status, for example, your status as the victim of a crime, in that context, then those protections are immaterial. Those protections do not exist. Moreover, if you fear that you will be deported if you call the police, you do not have police protection, because a social right that you have but you cannot actually exercise is not really a social right. And unless it becomes only New York, good old New York versus, bad Georgia, if you went to Long Island over the last decade and you called the police, and there's been Southern Poverty Law Center and the federal government has looked at this, the police in many of these municipalities would roll up and you'd say, I was robbed. What's your legal status? Are you illegal? All right? In that case, you don't enjoy police protection either. But what's interesting is that you've got then, you've got this importation of a particular kind of silence and a particular kind of culture, and it's malleable. It's not, not every place in Mexico is like this, just like every place in the United States is not one way or the other. But you get a profound transformation very rapidly that then has very, very important consequences for the way that the mothers parented, the way they interacted with social service agencies, the way they interacted with schools, and it had a variety of extremely positive effects in the way they thought about themselves, the way they acted, the way they were able to advocate for their kids. So this is an important thing for us to think about as we're looking at immigration reform and things like that. Okay, so I said there were 2 examples. I'm going to switch gears entirely now, talk about the second generation. So the second generation, these are the kids that I've been following for 10 to 15 years. And what's interesting here is in the negotiation of gender is, there's a narrative that, the classic narrative is that there's restrictive gender roles and everybody wants to be really macho in Mexico. And then there's open and enlightened gender roles in the United States and everybody wants to be really enlightened. Right? I know it sounds, I'm purposely using the adjective too many times to make it sound slightly ridiculous. But anyway, there's a dominant narrative in this, and I don't think I think it's not entirely true. I want to have a little bit more of a complicated picture. These are young men and women, and legal status I'm going to bring in as well that complicates the picture a little bit more. So these are young men and women who are growing up in the United States. Some of them are born here, and they're U.S. citizens. Some of them have had legal status since they were younger, and some of them have come in as kids and have never been able to get legal status because we've had a long moratorium in the United States. We've had, since the late 80s, it's been almost impossible to legalize your status unless you fall into certain categories. I know this is not news to anybody in this room. But how does this then affect the way that you become young men and young women and the way that you think about yourself? So these are people becoming young men and young women. They have to hit the appropriate socially expected steps in the socially expected duration. In the people I have been following all this time, in general, the women have a much more well-attuned sense of what it takes to become a successful adult according to the timeline of the transitions to adulthood now than men do. Men, for example, 23, 24 years old, would tell me, 18, 19 years old, they would tell me that by the time you're 25 or 26, you have to be done with your education, have a career, have a wife, and have kids. Right? This is a 23-and-a-half-year-old kid in his 3rd semester of community college with no girlfriend, right? 18 months from now, in order to be successful, he's got to have all of those 4 things. It's just not going to happen. Many of the women would tell me that in order to be, because I would say, what does it take to become a man or a woman, a full grown-up? And the women would tell me, you need to get your education and your job by the time you're 30. Then you can decide if you want to have kids and get married. But those things were not optional, or were not mandatory. They were optional. So this is interesting. All right, so how does legal status come into this? So the transition from adolescence to early adulthood to full adulthood, as we know, many of you who have kids who have gone to college and are now living with you again, that transition takes a lot longer than it used to. It's not as easy as it was back in the old days. But think about this. If you have a kid, compare this kid who's born here and has all these options versus this kid who came here, when he was 2 months old and is still an undocumented immigrant. He is going to, and I'm drawing here also on the work of Roberto Gonzalez as well as my own work. This young man is going to transition. He's going to become an adolescent, and his ability to fulfill the kinds of second-generation dreams, to keep the immigrant bargain that his parents want him to keep. You've got to get a job in an office. You've got to have your degree. You've got to have all these things. His ability to do that is going to be severely limited by his immigration status. So then what are your options for achieving an adult masculinity? Well, one of them is you could become a cholo. You could become like a gang member and say, if the society wants to get rid of me and doesn't want me to succeed, I'm going to become really bad and show you. You could become a failed second-generation man, right? This happens a lot in families. Why are you not like your brother? Why are you working in a restaurant and your brother's, gone to college and all this kind of stuff? You could become a first-generation, this happens a lot. Instead of becoming a 1.5 or a second-generation kid, you adopt the identity of a first-generation man. Then instead of becoming one of the children of immigrants, you sociologically become like an immigrant yourself, and you help support the younger kids. Or another option is that you could become a dreamer. Now this is actually the category that I think takes a tremendous amount of courage, because the dreamers, and I know there's a lot of you guys here, basically what the dreamers have said is, we know that we're excluded right now from making the transition. For example, we can go to college, but we can't get jobs that would pay us the money we should get from those jobs and have those lifestyles, but we're going to go anyway. And the thing that the dreamers are doing is basically challenging America to be as good as its ideals. I'm going to stop.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for a wonderful, wonderful, exciting panel. Donna talked about how gender relations have been ignored in many studies, the importance of seeing the feminization of immigration, not as a moral panic or a problem, but actually something that's predictable and can be expected. Carola did a wonderful job of giving us a picture of the psychological effects of immigration and its consequences, and how girls do better than boys, and trying to explain even recommendations for the future of research, including focusing on well-being rather than pathology, which I think has been a tremendous problem, not really looking at what has happened that's for those that do thrive. And then Robert did talk about the changed narrative of domestic violence victims. I thought that was very provoking. And the immigrant bargain, and how this dream will be curtailed by the undocumented status, and then challenging America. So this was an excellent panel, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Yes, please. Could you please, everyone, introduce themselves?
Sure. I don't think this is working. It is working now. Hello, thank you very much for your talks. I'm Hector Carrillo. I teach at Northwestern University in sociology and in gender and sexuality studies. And I do research on migration, sexuality, and health. And I wanted to go back to Donna's analysis, the contrast that you made when you showed us, the feminist side of things, and then on the other end, the empirical, highly positivist side. And I want to piggyback a little bit on Robert's talk as well, because it seems to me that there's a middle step they're missing that Robert alludes to, and that is the work that is both highly theoretically sophisticated, but also empirically based, that has been done on gender and migration. And I'm thinking here, of course, of Pierrette Congañón-Sotelo, who was mentioned earlier today, but also of the work by Gloria González-López, the book Erotic Journeys, and the very important work by Jennifer Hirsch on the migration from a town in Jalisco to Atlanta and back. And importantly, Hirsch shows us that, along with these other authors, that there's a part of the story of gender and migration that tends to be told less, and that is a very positive story, which has to do with the destabilization of gender relations, the dreaming of new ways of interacting, and also a huge impact not only on gender relations, but also on sexuality. And so I wanted to ask you all if you could comment on this, and in particular, following sort of the provocation of authors like Hirsch, about finding that the changes that are produced by migration in relation to gender are not produced only because of an enlightened United States, and I'm going to paraphrase what Robert was saying, and a backward Mexico. That in fact, when she goes back to the places in Mexico where the immigrants left from, the seeds of change are already there. They get propelled by migration in very interesting ways, but they are happening there, and often migrants are just trying to be like the people that stayed behind, who are changing sometimes more rapidly by them, than them. In my own work with Mexican gay immigrants, I find the same in terms of changes around gay and lesbian rights taking place in Mexico and the US. And I'm curious about your perspectives on this issue of change and the disparities between countries.
I'll just say two things very briefly. First of all, the scholarship that's being done in what you've called this middle ground is important, and I hope it is going to grow. There are many ways of doing gender analysis. There's an older tradition of gender analysis, which is both, I would say, radically empiricist and incredibly interested in the fluidity that has become the sort of label attached to postmodernist gender studies. So yes, for the middle in this case. The other thing I think I would say, and I'm an historian, right, so I look at that relationship between sending areas and receiving areas in the past, not in the present, but there's a very interesting historical literature that points to the kinds of transformations that occur in sending areas that parallel and diverge from what's happening in the receiving areas, that's driven more by migration than it is by some sort of ideological model of the receiving society as modern and uniquely, especially emancipatory for either men or women. So that's just a disciplinary observation that those kinds of changes that you refer to, you can actually document them in historical migrations as well.
So, yeah, I think one of the, when we talked about the panel, one of the hesitations I had was talking about the domestic violence work was that it would end up looking like the old bad machos versus the enlightened Americans, and that wasn't the intent. But I think I would pick up, and I in my own work I use Jennifer's work a fair bit. And your own, Hector, and one of the things that happens with migration, I think, is you very often get a renegotiation of the relationship between the couple, between the man and the woman, even if they've been married in a very traditional gender relationship in Mexico, you go to a new context and things change. And it's not that unusual, right? If you think about people who've been together a long time, right, you renegotiate your relationship as you move through the life course. One of you starts working. When one of them hasn't been working, you renegotiate these. So it's not rocket science. And I agree that I think it makes sense to be careful that you don't have ideological blinders where you have an old-fashioned, pre-modern world out of which people are coming into this new modern world where they're going to be improved and no longer prefer their old devices and things like that. That was a joke, by the way. So the other thing is you can also have second-generation men who seek to claim the gender privileges that they imagined that their fathers enjoyed in Mexico when they go back or with. So there's an imagination of this tremendous gender privilege that they then seek to enforce in their relationships, and very often the women push back like, no, that's not how this is going to work. Right? So yes, I appreciate the question.
Hello, my name is Jody Listberger. I direct the Gender and Women's Studies program at the University of Rhode Island. This is the second year that we have come and our students have read all of your work. One of the things that students did in the Critical Issues in Feminist Scholarship course was interview immigrants at the Community College of Rhode Island. And one of our findings for me was very unexpected, which was a woman, 30-year-old woman from Senegal, who was more debilitated than anything else by the shame she felt by not being able to say to her friends back in Senegal that actually she didn't have a big house, she doesn't own a car, she doesn't have a good job. I'm wondering, do you find that this shame that the immigrants feel, respective of their home countries, is gendered? Is it more severe for women than it is for men? And do you believe the pressures on men and women who come to this country are different? Thank you.
I would not say that the shame issues are more severe for men and women. I think that I hear a lot of the shame. I think that the sort of sense that the roads are paved in gold is an delusion that is shared by many immigrants. You know, the television and movies project that, I think it's very common that immigrants tend to tell the good stories, and they come back showering gifts, I think both men and women I have not found a particularly gendered. In fact, if anything, the men have bigger shame issues, I think. I don't know. I have not noticed. Go ahead.
If you could look at Pierrette Hondaño Sotelo's work on this. This is, but one of the things that in the past, one of the things that's happened around this issue has been, particularly before women were coming up, often you'd have men who were here, and they did not have the success that they wanted to have, so they didn't want their families to come up, right? What would be the sense of bringing my family up to live badly when I'm supposed to be making the money? And women would say, but I don't want to stay, we can't stay apart like this is not working, and they would come up anyway. And so there was a renegotiation of that. I don't think the shame thing is the province of one gender or the other, but I do think that it gets experienced in gendered ways.
I would point to one gender dimension for the historical migrations that I know best, which are Catholic Southern Italians who came to the United States 100 years ago, often involving lengthy family separations. In the homeland, migration itself to the United States was seen as threatening female morality and sexuality that they carried with them when they returned home, which large numbers of them did, and an aura of taint from having lived in a Protestant, dissolute, modern, hyper-commercial America, and that's already 100 years ago. I don't know if that has any counterpart in today's world. I haven't run into it in the literature that I've read, at least.
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop for a second. I feel that I'm getting tons and tons of questions from the audience, and I want to be fair to the other group. One of the questions is, can you speak more about the positive outcomes that can arise from the particular vulnerabilities that we see when thinking about the gender dynamics of migration? Courage, epistemic privileges.
Migration is a selective process. It's gender selective, and it's selective on a whole range of individual attributes that are also gendered. At least as I understand it, it's the strongest, ambitious, most well-qualified who migrate, even when they're very, very poor people. They're young, they're dynamic, they're vulnerable, but those kinds of strengths allow at least some of them facing the challenges of inequality to overcome. It's that notion of persistence and toughness with which I think Sonia started us out this morning.
Yeah, I would add to those positive qualities optimism. Certainly optimism is a huge positive trait. And I think there's some evidence of maybe physical and psychological health as positive traits. And I don't know that there's a whole lot of research that looks at the interaction of gender as, on the positive end. I think most of the research is on looking at the pathologies, and I think that that's where we need, we can make guesses, but we don't have a whole lot of serious research. The funding is all about looking for where the fire is, where the pathology is. And so, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that looks for the interaction of gender and well-being. But it's a great question.
Yes, please. Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Noam Osband. I'm a PhD student in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. And my dissertation is going to be a documentary film about Mexican H-2B workers who come and do reforestation work in the American Southeast in these companies owned by old hippies in the Ozarks. It's an interesting story. My question is for Robert. I'd like to know more. I was really interested in what you're saying about how people who participate in these domestic abuse investigations, how that can be a pathway in part to changing your legal status. And what I'm curious about is knowing if that impacts, are there police who sort of then will become skeptical of investigations, wondering if people are doing it to try to get legal status? And likewise, in communities where people are making accusations of domestic abuse, the fact that it can impact legal status, are there people who will then doubt those accusations, or does it change how how they are conceived by the collective?
Great question. Part of my answer is I don't know. But you would think that there would, if there's a system, someone's going to try to game it, right? And cops are very skeptical. They think everybody's always gaming the system. In the cases that I have looked at and the people I've talked to, usually the problem is the other way. That they have the woman who's abused who does not want to press charges because, I mean, think about what's going to happen. Her husband is going to get deported, and she's going to get legal status. So she's really completely breaking the family up. It's not even just she's going to live in another apartment or in another city or something. So usually it's trying to get people to actually go forward with the process. I mean, sometimes it's that the people are done and they're ready to leave, and it's like this is manna from heaven that they have this chance to legalize. But it could very well be. I don't know enough about whether or not people are using the system and whether people are skeptical.
I'm going to read another question. As a teacher of immigrants, I frequently hear parents lament that even when they have come as a family unit, they feel that American culture ends up disrupting their family traditions. Has there been any research into how to help second generations bridge that divide?
Well, I mean, there is research. I mean, there are some good programs that do work in schools. Like there are the international schools in New York City that are particularly adept at doing that kind of work. There is research. I mean, the more culturally sensitive the schools are, the more willing they are to engage the families, the better the better they do. But so there is research. If you come see me, I can hook you up with that.
There's another dimension to this. Part of what happens, I think, is the kids and the parents really grow up in very different ways. They have different experiences. And not only that, the parents very often, particularly the men, are working so many hours and they're under such stress that not only are the parents outside of their context and they don't have the cultural practices in the local places where they're living that they had back home, but they don't have the time to spend with the kids. And they, look, anybody who has teenagers understands how hard it is sometimes for American teenagers to have their American parents understand them, right? They sometimes, there's rueful laughter. And imagine if there's if you've been dislocated. But in some of the ethnographic work that I've done, one of the things that has been very successful has been that one thing is going back to the parents' home country. The other is participation in rituals that don't always require the parents and the kids to talk, that they can do stuff together and enjoy them without having to talk. I mean, like if you came to the concert last night, or there's certain athletic events or stuff like that, because sometimes it's not easy to talk to teenagers. A lot of times they don't want you to talk to them, right? But you can still share things. Yes, I am. Although that's not the case right now, so everybody keep your fingers crossed. So, and the other small piece I would add is creating community institutions that create that kind of space is really, really important, right? So spending the money, and public money as well on after-school programs and things like that, and, having a robust civil society that can support those kinds of community spaces, right? If you've got families that are working with lots of people working lots of hours, you can't just say, okay, well, you've had your chance. There needs to be a place for those kids to go and to develop themselves and to thrive. And anyway.
I guess as a sort of quick comment, this notion that migrant parents have difficulties with their teenagers because of migration is not a contemporary phenomenon. If anybody here besides me grew up in an Italian immigrant family, Managgia l'America, which kind of means curse you, America, usually focused on conflicts between the generations and the lack of respect that America taught kids.
My name is Lila Feingold. I worked for 21 years with immigrant teenagers in the western part of the state. And we were talking about your, I can't see anybody's name, Robert Smith's comments about the viewpoint of the boys versus the girls about how they were going to grow up and how they were going to establish themselves and how they were going to make their families and the timeline they expected that to be on, and how the girls were on a very different timeline than the boys, and the boys were under all this pressure. My own experience was more even, that the girls in those families were often not even thinking they wanted to go to school, but they didn't think they would really have much of a chance, or maybe they'd go to community college for a couple of years and get an LPN, or, and then they were going to be married and have families. They were seeing the similar timeline. So my question is, what do you think was the situation among the group you were working with where the boys would succumb to that pressure, but the girls somehow could transcend it? Or in some terms, it's a class difference almost. It's like the boys are continuing within a sort of a working class paradigm. You go to school, you get done, you raise your family, boom. And the girls are sort of reaching for a more middle class view of, and then we study, and then we do this, and we don't have our family until we're in our 30s. How, do you have any sense, do you have a sense why the boys do their thing? Do you have any sense why the girls are so different?
No, I actually would agree with you. The part of this is it's a 12-minute presentation, and I can only focus on certain things. So another piece, and so I was trying to compare similar groups. These were more successful kids. There was a significant number of girls who did do the early transition of, either getting pregnant or dropping out. But the thing that was also interesting was it wasn't a thing that they necessarily saw, even if they had the kid, as a 20-something-year-old, they didn't see this as like they had arrived at being full adults. They still said, okay, by the time I'm 30, I want to go do these things and these things and these things. I'm not completely sure. This is but yes, it's not entirely just the boys one way and the girls the other. There was a lot of early transition among girls as well. What I was trying to do there was look at the way they were negotiating how to become young men and young women. So when the book is done, I'll have a more complicated and comprehensive picture for you. So, but it's a fair question.
Excuse me, let me read one so I can alternate. Another person from the audience says, I'm a daughter of immigrants who was born in Boston, educated here through college, and then lived in Northern California for 8 years. I found living in California profoundly transformative in expanding possible career paths for a person of color. The presentations today speak of the U.S. as a homogeneous experience. Can speakers speak to regional differences on the issues we have heard about, and what can be learned from that, if anything?
It's a great question.
Great question.
Well, I immigrated when I was a child to California, lived there until I was until I was 30, and then moved to the Northeast. Was in Boston for 10 years, and then 10 years in New York, and I'm happily back in California. So I can relate to that question in deep ways. There certainly are regional differences, and the enclave that you come to makes tremendous differences, and are you a member of the dominant, is there an immigrant group, are you in a highly diverse space? New York City is a very diverse space. California in general is a diverse space. Are there other immigrants of your group? Or are you the only, I'm a Swiss immigrant. How many Swiss immigrants were there in 1965 in LA? Not that many. So it's like, so all of that makes a big difference in the psychological space that you're occupying, in the economic space that you're occupying, in the opportunity structure that you're occupying, in the political sphere, in the national messages about your group, all of that. So it's a very important and an interesting question to be thinking about, absolutely.
really important question, and it's a challenge to both the historical and the social science and humanities scholarship, I think, to take it up. The different regions of the United States have dramatically different histories of both migration and race relations, and for many years, I think we tried to cram the study of migration into a black-white understanding of race that was more typical of the American South, or into an immigrant paradigm, which perhaps describes historically the Northeast. I think each and every one of us, regardless of field, needs to take those differences seriously. Our personal experiences of crossing boundaries certainly confirm that they are very, very real. An Anglo in California is still an Irish American in Boston, and there are dozens of comparable examples one could list.
So, I want to give one quick answer to that. So, as I understand the question, it has to do with what the relationship between your sort of, what the meaning of your ethnicity is within a certain context, whether people expect you to be mobile or not mobile. And one of the things I would say that the work over the last 20 years has showed us is that the link between ethnicity and people's expectations or your expected mobility, those things only ossify when they're closely linked, right? So when all of the Mexican kids or all of the black kids are doing badly, then that becomes a thing that becomes linked. But immigration over the last 20 years and post-civil rights, affirmative action, and other changes have made those things very, very different. And I'll very briefly say two things. One of them is there's a study by a guy named Tomas Jimenez who talks about the fact that in Cupertino, California now, and I'll just give one example. An Asian fail is getting an A-, and a white fail is getting an F. Right? Because whites have now become seen as the slacker underachievers within the context of a school district that's very, very high achieving Asian American. In the work that I've done in New York, Mexicans have adopted black identities to become upwardly mobile in certain places and have chosen to go to the schools they see as the black schools to be upwardly mobile because there's a lot of upwardly mobile black children and they want to do well like those kids. Right? So I'm not saying that this means everything is different, but the old ideas that white people are going to be here and then minorities are going to slot in someplace else are changing very profoundly. And I think it's a very good thing that that the link between ethnicity and mobility is not it's not as sort of apparently ironclad as it had been in the past.
Hi, my name is Elena Stone, and I work for the Ethnic Institutes at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and also teach in the program on women in politics and public policy there. And one issue that hasn't been mentioned very much, and I'm curious what your take on it is in terms of immigration experience in general, but also if you see it in a gendered way, is the issue of language. The issue of learning a new language, loss of language, how second language learners are treated in the educational system, and what that might mean for development and learning and upward mobility. So I would love to hear your take on that and whether you see any gendered issues, any gender differences in how that issue affects people.
Well, I'll address that briefly. In our own data of newcomer kids who came, we looked at 400 immigrant newcomers who were on average 12 years old and had been in the country when we recruited them about 2 years, and we followed them for 5 years. We looked at lots of, factors of adaptation and looked at a couple of outcomes, GPA and how they did on achievement tests. And one of the things we gathered was English language proficiency. So we had data, we actually had data on that. And we looked at, how they did at year 3 and then how they did at year 5. So when we compare them to national norms, they really did very poorly, like 85 85% of them were, a standard deviation below national norms, and, it was a very good predictor of how they did on grades, on GPA, and as well as on achievement tests. So 2 stories. One is there was no difference between countries of origin. So, it didn't matter what country you came from, they all did more or less the same. So, the usual story is, oh, the Chinese do so much better than everybody else. That's not a Chinese story. We had this conversation yesterday. This is no difference between the Chinese, the Haitian, the Mexican, etc. So there's not a country of origin story. There wasn't a gender story either. So language acquisition, no difference between men and women. That's not. Remember what I said at the very end of my story? It's always interesting to think about what's a gender story and what's not a gender story. That's not particularly a gendered story. It's hard for everybody to learn a second language. It takes a very long time. That's.
Hi, I'm Susan Barton Young. I'm a school teacher at Casco Bay High School in Portland, Maine, and I'm here with a student, Safia, who wants to ask a question, as well as 12 of her colleagues who are all in our English language learner senior pre-college English class. Safia.
How are you?
Hi,
Welcome.
I'm Sophia.
Hello, Sophia.
I had a question, is that have you looked into situations where children were the ones who came and supported families?
Say it again.
Is there a situation where children came and worked to support families?
In order
back
to
home?
support their own families?
Like
To
their
support
parents,
their parents.
like parents, yeah.
Historically, yes.
It's children coming to support their parents
Back home or
To
here?
financially support their family?
back home.
Yeah.
Back home?
It's
Yeah.
very common historically.
Would they face more challenges than like an adult? Because it's very harder for children, but I think this, but I think it's very harder for children to adjust in the American culture more than a parent, because it's not easy going to school, and it's not easy to, It's not easy to adjust in an American culture where they believe anything culture will change in a certain way, but how can they support a family back home and still be themselves and still like want to achieve more in a country where they're like always changing?
Historically, children who supported their families back home went to work at 13 or 14, and there was no law against that in the United States. So one could say then, and probably now, one sacrifices one education in order to support one's family. But the flow of remittances from both children, as we consider them, and adults attest to how common this was in the past. I can say less about the present, although I know plenty of teenage students who are struggling to get through high school and college in Minnesota, which is where I live, who are doing exactly what you say. And the trade-offs are troubling. My impression, and it's only an impression, is that girls are doing better with that juggling, for example, in the Somali community in Minneapolis, than the boys are doing. But that's just an impression from working with Somali students as students.
I would just say that I don't have data on that, because those were not the children that I followed, the children and adolescents that I followed. But there's tremendous. It's very difficult to immigrate. It's difficult for everyone to immigrate. I mean, all things being equal, people would rather stay home with their families, right? I mean, I think that do not underestimate that. It's just any transition is hard. Immigration is a really tough job. So people would rather stay home if they could. And the psychological changes that go with migration are just difficult. And it's really hard on kids, and I think kids get forgotten in the equation. So everything we know about migration for children is mostly done when there's an adult in the family. There's almost nothing written about what happens to kids when they have to do it themselves. And you add on top of that responsibility, so that they have to adjust by themselves with no adult around, or adults they barely know. And then the responsibility of adding, having to take care of work and then send money back to their family. That's obviously going to be very, very difficult. So hats off to those children. Anyway.
And the only thing I'd add, is, I mean, as if it's not hard enough to be just a teenager already and then have to be a teenager and be sending money back and all that stuff. The only thing I would say that I've heard with teenagers who have problems, who are immigrants, you're not the only person who has this problem, so seek help. The fact that you're here with your teacher, actually the fact that you're here at all is great. I'm really happy that you and your classmates came today. And if there's problems, get help, because maybe somebody can help you. Even if you're just feeling overwhelmed, there's no specific problem. So anyway, that's my advice.
Can I
I'm
add
glad you
just
came.
Can I add just one thing, and that is that although many students aren't the main financial support of their families, the desire to help their families is, I think, one of the things that motivates the numbers that Ruben showed us this morning, where a very high percentage of young women are in the scholarly field to study immigration, and my own undergraduate and graduate students of recent immigrant origin are incredibly committed to giving back to their communities through publicly engaged scholarship so that their education builds their families and their communities. And that's one of the reasons that I love being at a land-grant institution in the Midwest.
I wanted to cover a few more questions from our audience. One question is, discuss intersectional issues. I'm especially concerned about the effects of global capitalism, the absence of material analysis, the class objectives, who gets to lean in, who is utilized to keep those in power in power.
First of all, I'm not exactly sure why there's the perception that there's an absence of material or class analysis here. I'd say actually with the rise of postmodernist approaches to scholarship, both intersectionality and, if you want to think of it this way, a declining interest in material or historically material approaches did kind of develop. Many of us, including your dean and I, were of a generation where the study of immigration and the study of labor and capital inequalities were linked incredibly closely. And I continue to see that interest certainly in my own students and graduate students.
I mean, the larger question is, why aren't you focusing on sort of the way that the evolution of global capitalism as a malevolent force in the world is affecting the gender relations you're looking at? It's a fair question, right? I mean, there's lots of malevolence in global capitalism. There's some good things, but there's a lot more malevolent, awful stuff. But on the other hand, the thing I would just say is you can only focus on so many things when you're doing a study. And if global capitalism is the thing that's causing everything that you're looking at, you're not going to be able to explain anything, right? I mean, how many globes are there? There's one, right? And so if the only one you're looking at is the one that's full of capitalism, then, I mean, I'm being slightly flip, but it's, I think you have to figure out ways to get purchase on those kinds of issues. I don't think that it's useful to have global capitalism as the prime mover in every analytical explanation of whatever you're looking at. I do think that it has that the celebration of capitalism as promoting democracy and freedom and justice throughout the world is at its very best a profoundly erroneous notion.
And I would actually, as somebody who made an argument at the end of my talk for the freedom of movement, translating into the freedom to stay, I would just want to point out to you that global capitalism creates inequality, but nation states limit people's right to move or forcing them to move or to stay put. This is not just about global capital, but the relationship between systems of nation states that are actually, as in the United States, at this very moment, driving what the rules are.
Just what they said. And, and so people are forced out or pulled out or pushed out by, forces that are going on economically and by policies, and then people have to adjust. And then that's what we look at. And we can't look at everything at any one time, and we were asked to comment in 12 minutes. So
thanks everyone for a fantastic audience and a fantastic panel.